Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. We will do our 30-second silent pause while everyone trickles in. We'll make for awkward silence for everyone. See if anyone can break the silence. I can't stay quiet. Come on now. Everyone's still hyped up on candy from Halloween.
Yeah,
Paula, did you dress up as anything while over Halloween?
I did not, but I did negotiate for a bunch of candy from my daughter. So I have
What's the go-to for you?
um, Reese's.
Reese's?
Yeah,
How about you, Anthony?
Same thing, not to copy, but it's a good one.
Great. I think we've killed enough time here now that we know everyone's. I think mine is peanut M&Ms in case everyone's always about my weakness. But let's get started. So I'm gonna share my screen, and we'll kind of just do like a little intro. So welcome to our annual Planning Unplugged AMA series. We'll do some intros. We'll talk a little bit about what what to expect today. So the big thing is that we want to see questions from you all. So feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A box, and we'll address them as we go. Any context you're able to share will help give us the most relevant response. And you can also upvote if you feel like this is the one I want to hear. And then we will, of course, share the recording in a summary after the session. Intros. We're going to be talking a little bit about coverage and capacity today. And you'll probably see some familiar faces. And we'll just start with the FullCast side of things, since I think that's kind of what we've been doing on our previous AMAs. So my name's Tyler, and I head up our customer success team, and I will be kind of running both. Here's my little 2 cents, and then also managing all the questions today. And hopefully I'll share some of our little anecdotes from what we've seen with customers and what we consider as best practices. Bala, I will hand it off to you.
thank you, Tyler. Hello, everybody. Bala Balabaskaran, co-founder, CTO of FullCast. And I run product and engineering here, but prior to that, I've been an operator in the field working on these problems. So happy to share some anecdotes that I've experienced in my career, as well as working with a lot of customers at FullCast. So welcome.
And our special guest, which some of you may recognize from, I don't know what, 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, Anthony Enrico.
Yeah, I think I have a residency at the FullCast webinars now. So no, thanks for having me back. I'm founder, CEO of LeanScale. We're a RevOps as a service consultancy. And before doing LeanScale, I was the head of RevOps for 3 scaling technology companies. So lots of battle scars on the topics we're going to go through today, and excited to hop in.
Great. Since everyone's always a little shy to start, I think what we'll do is we'll start with a prepared question for everyone, and then that'll maybe, get people clamoring for their own questions. So how do you assess, and this is talking about capacity analysis, so I think, this is very open-ended here, but how do we begin to assess and plan for the necessary sales capacity to meet your coverage objectives?
Yeah, I can start and I can lean in.
Yeah, before.
The part I like to start with is usually goal setting. So understanding what your goals are for the next quarter, what your goals are for the next year, and using those goals to understand the size and type of sales force you're going to need to attain those goals. And then you can usually reverse engineer from there. So if you know what your goals are, you have a good idea of what your sales team today can do. It should give you a good understanding of what gaps you may need to fill or changes you need to make in order to have the coverage for those new goals.
Agree. Usually starts with my experience starts with sort of the financial plan. Typically comes out of exercise in finance, and you sort of get, I think, two numbers which are sort of crucial for looking at this. One is the goal for next year, as Anthony said. What the revenue goals, what are the targets, what are we trying to do? And then the other side of the coin is your expense envelope, which is how much money do you have to spend on the resources of the team and so on, right? So those are typically the guidances that finance would sort of give you. Sometimes there are other soft goals, such as expanding into a market, a new product, or things like that. That tends to also drive those discussions. So there may be some critical strategic goals that might be part of that discussion. But typically, these are the two numbers that everybody cares about. So if you start with that, and then, as Anthony said, reverse engineer your way back into what you think you're going to need. A big part of the analysis, I think, that Tyler, you called out, that I see a lot of people struggling with, is just figuring out where people are and what they're doing, and what their ramp it looks like, and who's on what territory, what quota are they carrying. And unfortunately, if you don't maintain it over the course of the year, you'll end up with situations where finance has a different understanding of the current deployment of capacity versus what sales might be actually dealing with on the ground. So there's usually a lot of time spent trying to get these spreadsheets to sync between the two organizations. And I think that again comes down to a little bit of discipline and making sure you're maintaining that data throughout the year. But that's the sort of the start of the analysis. And then, of course, some of the key things that you're obviously looking for to reverse engineer to how many people you're going to need. Talk about ramp. What does that look like, right? And the productivity of your resources, like how do you define productivity of a resource is usually a very loaded question. But typically what you're trying to figure out is, okay, if we hire somebody, how long does it take for them to get going? And then also, what is the productivity that we can expect out of each of the resources that we have towards that goal, right? And once you have these sort of two big numbers, then it becomes easier to sort of reverse engineer in terms of the number of people you're going to need. I'm, of course, oversimplifying this like crazy, but that's kind of the overall skeleton of what you're trying to do at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think sorry, go ahead, Tyler.
We do this all the time.
I know, we just get so eager to jump in.
I know. You can't keep me quiet. This is the exact thought I had, though, Bala, was like, you could make this really simple, right? And do this just back of the napkin math in terms of like, here's the number, here's approximately how productive people are, and here's how many people I need, right? And be done. But then you can also just go off the rails and make this really complicated with a bunch of different inputs. And that's when you start thinking about like ramp, the productivity by role, by if you've already been at the company, you're transferring, and now you start to get all these different inputs, and you're kind of almost playing with, well, what happens when we put somebody in EMEA versus AMER, and there's productivity differences there. And then that almost is like rolling back up, and then you're doing this tops down, bottoms up thing, which we usually talk a lot about. And it's trying to like reconcile all of that stuff to get to ultimately a goal or an agreement, all the while keeping your expense envelope in not blowing that out of proportion either, right? So
it typically starts with that back of the envelope logic, right? And then you sort of get more complex as you look at the different aspects of the business and try to build it out. As you said, all of those complexities come into play if you're trying to get as close to the number as you can, right? In terms of how accurate you want to be with that forecasting. So, Anthony, you were about to say something before Tyler rudely interrupted you.
No. Politely interrupted. I was gonna I'm happy actually Tyler jumped in because I want to piggyback on something. Yes, you can start with some back of the napkin math. And I wanted to go through some of the gotchas, like what do people miss? And these are the common ones. The first one is segmenting. And that's where it gets exponentially more complex because you may have a few different variables, like a different product, a different region, a different firmographic segment. And then now you need to build 12 models, 20 models that you then roll up to a higher model. So segmenting your model really becomes the part that complicates it the most, but it's so important because the other things that you want to make sure you have, make sure you really understand ramp time. And when we say ramp time, we don't mean just training. So yeah, you'll need the 30-day whatever onboarding to make sure they know your product and service, but how long does it take to build pipeline and close that pipeline? And for that, you really need to know your sales cycle and conversion rate for that segment. So if you have a 90-day sales cycle, you really can't expect a rep to be productive faster than 90 days, unless you have an overflow of pipeline that you're just going to hand to them to close, but that's usually not the case. And then making sure you understand the conversion rate will give you what you need to know of how much pipeline you need to build. And then one that I feel like people forget a lot, because maybe it's a hard one to admit, is attrition. So you'll say, great, we need to double our results, so we're going to double our sales force. Well, maybe not, because of the hires that you make, how many of them will be a good fit and will make it? And of the hires that you already have ramped up, are you certain that 100% of them are going to stay for the whole year? So usually, if you're big enough, you can take a look at some historical data to see what your attrition rate might be, and you can apply that as a given. If you're smaller, you may want to go rep by rep and just see, okay, do we think it's likely that one of these people will leave? And then I would assume if you're hiring a lot, count on a couple of the hires not working out.
Yeah. Smart. The other thing too, and we can wrap up on this, and we do have a couple questions, but is also seasonality. I don't know. I don't think you mentioned either of you mentioned that, but just thinking about the seasonality of the business into your productivity profile is just another layer that we can add that really love the complex nature of that. So, and I'll just piggyback on this with Simon here mentioning, we mentioned productivity is a loaded question. What have you seen that is a good way to define productivity? I feel like we kind of talked about that, and I don't know if anything, you guys have any additional ways to like just summarize that or add to that.
Yeah, I think there's two things we talked about. One is sort of defining productivity in terms of the output that you would see from a resource, right? So you can incorporate into that, as Anthony mentioned, attrition and things like that can be incorporated at an aggregate level into that number. So you can sort of generally say, we expect X amount of business out of each individual in the team or each fully ramped individual in the team. And so you should sort of build up that number. Now, there's a lot that goes into that number. Ramp obviously is one of those things. Productivity is one of those things. But also when we think about ramp, one of the things that we think about, the main thing that we think about is the person ramping, right? But in a number of cases, depending on the segmentation, you might actually have the business itself ramping in that region. What I mean by that is if you open up shop in a geographical area where nobody knows who you are, there is a ramp that you need to sort of think about in terms of the business becoming familiar to the people in that region, right? So it's not just the individual ramping in terms of understanding your product and being able to sell it, but it's also the business being able to ramp in a new region versus a region where you have operated for many years, right? So you sort of have to think about those aspects when we're talking about productivity, when we're talking about output. For example, a team of 10 fully ramped AEs are going to have an entirely different number in terms of the productivity versus a team with 8 people that you just hired that are all ramping, right? So even though you have 10 people in the team, doesn't mean the productivity out of that team is the same. So there's a lot of factors that go into the definition of what you mean by productivity. Seasonality plays a role, as you mentioned, Tyler.
I'm curious on your take on this, Bala and Tyler. I think a lot of people think of productivity as I put more sales reps somewhere, therefore I will get more productivity out of the model.
Right.
And I've seen a lot of people who plan that way of, great, we're going to drop 10 reps in Europe, and then that's how we're going to hit our goal. I like to think of it more as you've created enough demand to where you need more reps to close the demand.
Yeah.
And I like limiting it to how much demand you're able to generate and create, rather than expecting sales reps to generate and create the demand themselves. One, because they can really only do it in half of their time. The other half they should be closing. And two, it's a very expensive way to generate demand versus some other channels you could leverage. So I think some people in their planning, they think, cool, here's my money producing reps that will just go create money for me. When it's really, no, you should go find where the gold mines are before you bring the miners in to go get it.
That's right. And so I sort of think of that as, cross-checking your models, both tops down and bottoms up, or outside in and inside out. Because definitely, if you're not generating the demand in the regions, however many reps you put in there, they're not going to generate enough demand if there isn't that supporting outside in perspective, right? So whenever I think of a capacity model, you kind of have to look at it from both angles, both from your pipeline and any sort of forward-looking signals that you have that'll tell you, this is kind of the demand that we expect to see in this region. That's kind of why I was talking about with the ramp of the market itself, in terms of how much demand you can easily generate versus what you're going to see from your reps, right? And so the more not saturated, but the more familiar you are with the market, obviously the people are going to be a lot more productive in that market versus a new market where you don't have that much of a presence. So that to me is the tops down, bottoms up, to make sure that you kind of land somewhere where both of those models sort of make sense.
Okay. I have a point, but I think we should move on because it's mostly just rehashing. All right. What strategies, let's this anonymous attendee here. What strategies have you implemented to ensure your coverage model is both scalable and sustainable?
Well, I think one is just making sure you have the markers to measure all of the assumptions in your model. So some of the things we talked about were ramp and sales cycle and conversion rate and being able to segment your model. So can you measure those in real time in your CRM or your tech stack? And do you have goals for all the things that you need to measure? Then you can track, is it working? And if it's not, or you see things not hitting your assumption, as an example, maybe you had an assumption that conversion rates would be 20%, which drove your pipeline production goal. Well, after a few months or maybe a quarter in, if you see it's more like 15%, you may need to adjust it and redo your plan for the next quarter. So I think those things are really important to make sure that you have things in place to measure. So technology is a good one after you get the foundation and processes in place.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges with building something that, from a coverage standpoint, is the appropriate attribution. Now, especially for sales reps, like the core sales reps, obviously you have attribution in the CRM. That's usually the first thing that gets set up, right? But as soon as you start adding additional roles and you start experimenting with different ways of sort of accelerating the productivity or driving more business, you introduce industry luminaries into the picture, for example, right? And so these roles, one of the biggest challenges with sort of understanding the ROI that they're producing is really the attribution in your systems, right? And being able to relate the contribution that these overlay roles as well as these additional roles are providing to the productivity of the team as a whole. That's where I've seen a lot of companies struggle with it, right? And everybody sort of comes up with, okay, we'll just add another overlay, and that should speed up the process, or that should speed up the sales cycle, or we can make the core sales reps more productive if somebody else did the demos, or if somebody else did the SOW work, or whatever the scenario is, right? But it becomes harder and harder to sort of attribute the actual contribution of those people into those conversion rates and productivity rates if you're not tracking them correctly, right? And that's one of those areas where the core sales rep seems to be fairly well defined, but the moment you have overlay roles and things like that, that tends to sort of be more of a guess in the wind rather than an actual database. And that makes the coverage model quite unsustainable, because you're going to get questioned on the value of these roles all the time to sort of invest. And that's one of the common things that I've seen happen over and over again.
Not going to interrupt you, Anthony.
I was waiting for you. Just one thing to add, I think, is also having a mantra of always planning. Because if you wait, because the question's about sustainability and making sure that it's scalable. If you wait until Q3 to do an annual plan, there's just going to be so many new factors that if you're not really doing this, I'd say measuring at least on a monthly basis to everything that you planned, but planning on a quarterly basis and making adjustments is really important. So making sure that your team is in that rhythm, your company's in that rhythm, and you have the processes and capabilities to do that will help keep it fresh, because you're going to need to add more things as the year goes on. You'll launch new initiatives, there will be changes in the market, and you're going to have to refresh your plan. So just going in with the mindset of, okay, I'm going to have to do this probably every month or quarter will also help keep it fresh as you go.
That's right. I have just a little bit of a question on that particular area, Anthony. Is it, when we started, we talked about this sort of nice linear progression of plan coming from finance, where they'll give you the target and then they give you the expense envelope. But in reality, you get a guidance, you get a range, you get, maybe this is, we want to hit revenue between these ranges, because when you typically get up to that point, you're still probably in Q3 or Q4. The business hasn't closed yet. The books haven't been closed for the year. So then, finance typically doesn't give you an exact number. And throughout the course of the next 6 to 8 weeks, you're going to see that number fluctuate, right? And so if you get into planning and you're sort of thinking about how to deploy those dollars appropriately, how have you managed scenarios where the number keeps changing and you still have to make sure that you are able to sort of refresh your plan to reflect that? And how do you handle that sort of scenario?
Yeah, that's why it's important to have just the infrastructure set up to be able to do planning quickly, because things will change. You may release your plan, but then, hey, we decided that now's the time for us to raise money, and we need to really get to this revenue target so we can raise it the multiple we'd like to raise. So we have to change things. And we're going to deploy a little bit more capital than we had to. Where can we put it? So I think the biggest thing is just having the process and infrastructure in place so you can react quickly, and anticipate changes and expect changes. I agree. I think it's more of a guideline and guidance based on whatever your company's strategic goals are. So I wish there was more to it than that. But I think just making sure you're able to do it fast is important to React. Did that answer it?
No, it does, because that's when you have to go beyond just the capacity model and actually build out the entire plan, build out territories and segments and things like that, you're putting in a lot of work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if that number up front keeps changing in terms of I've had this to deal with this where the number keeps changing until the business closes at the end of Q4. And when you're doing that, of course, there can be a huge variability in how much money you have to spend and how many resources you can deploy. So one of the strategies that we have used in the past is to say, okay, we're going to pick the core resource sets that we're going to stabilize, and maybe the core AEs or the SDR population or whatever the core capacities are that we need. And there can be a huge variability on all the overlays, right? So we'll sort of cut down on the overlays depending on what the number turns out to be. So there are techniques like that we've used to sort of continue planning, because you're spending a lot of time building these plans while at the same time being able to adapt to the variability in that guidance that's being provided. But as you said, the key thing is make sure you have a process. Make sure that you are sort of thinking about it as a continuous plan. Because that allows you to adjust, I think, a lot easier than if you just thought, okay, I get a number and that's it. It's cast in stone. I'm going to go do my planning. It never quite works out that way.
Yeah, and then if you don't have the real-time feedback, you need to be able to get the feedback up too. So let's say ramp is taking longer. Let's say there's more attrition. Okay, maybe we hired an agency to go hire these salespeople and half of them aren't working out. You may need to adjust, or else you won't hit the goals that you have in time.
Right.
So like, oh, if ramp's 5 months instead of 3, oh, well, we need to move up that hiring class a couple months earlier, maybe a quarter earlier, because we have some new data that is a different assumption than we have in the core plan. So it's you have to be doing it real time.
Yeah.
You have to be doing it real time. You have to be doing it constantly, continually. You can't just be sitting down to do an annual offsite and hope that it works out.
That's right. And typically the Excel formula models or whatever, or the tools or whatever you're using is usually set up so you can punch in the numbers and it'll sort of calculate. But I think where the biggest time is taken is on all the data collection and then the cleaning of the data,
yeah,
and all of that, right? So if you leave that work to the very end, it's not going to move fast, right? You have to go through that motion. So it's always better to kind of keep the data clean and have a discipline in sort of maintaining that data. So you're not in like November trying to go through spreadsheets and cleaning data at that time.
We work with some companies. One company we work with, they're doing over 500 million in revenue, and they have a weekly business review for all of the key components of their annual planning. Yeah. They're measuring by segment every single week. So I mean, it's that level of finger on the pulse for a company of that size and complexity is possible, and is, for that particular company, I think has helped them grow at the speed that they're growing, because they know exactly where to make adjustments once they start to see something move off.
Right.
I'm going to kind of bring this back to this coverage model being scalable and sustainable, because I just have I like rat holed into like competing roles and overlays, right? So just conflicting is really the word. You have like an AE, and this ties in with comp too, because like if you have an AE that's responsible for just in general, like closed won, net new, ARR, and you have an overlay that you've created as a part of your coverage model to take care of a product or something like that, and they're compensated on something else. And it also is like, kind of goes back, Bala, to attribution too. And if you're like not like splitting comp in a way, or you're only giving it to one person or the other, so then you have kind of people that are competing against over accounts, and this should be mine or that should be yours. And that tends to lend itself to not really be sustainable or scalable, because as things grow, there's going to be more conflicts and people will be kind of fighting over those things. So I think my point is just like, also consider how, when you enter like overlay roles or any of these other roles that you are putting into your coverage model, also consider how comp is designed around them too, because that will also play a factor in it too.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I think the incentives have to encourage teaming as opposed to infighting, right? Which happens a lot.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's hard. I think having really well-defined rules of engagement, having territories designed where you can make them modular. So as you bring new people in, it's very easy for you to set up and carve out new territories, and ones that are fair. So you've distributed that expectation of productivity fairly across the sales team. That's a really important part of not just operationalizing the planning, but the execution piece of the plan.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. For example, the XDR plus AE model has been popular in SaaS, but not always guaranteed to work for every business. Are there any alternative coverage models that we've seen that work particularly well? How about just an AE?
I'm guessing I'm guessing the question is, have we seen different ratios of XDRs? So SDR, BDR to an AE?
Yeah.
I think more around the model itself. Like, I can tell you from our perspective at FullCast, the SDR model doesn't work. Right? We've tried it many times over, and it just doesn't work for us. And so to the point of the question, I think that was made pretty popular by Salesforce back in the day, and this whole idea of kind of industrializing your sales process. But unfortunately, it really, for me, you have to map the coverage model to match the customer experience. That's the key, right? And I keep saying this in every webinar. But when you think about the coverage model, really what you're trying to do is match how the customer is working with your organization, right? What does their journey with your organization look like? You can't really force a template onto your customer, because that always results in sort of bad experience. That's just the way I look at it.
Yeah, same. I think it just depends on your company, your business model, how you get in front of customers. In Lean Scale's portfolio of customers, we have some that have SDR machines that are working very well, and then we have some that they don't have SDRs, or how they use their SDR BDRs is very different. Some are really inbound driven, so they're sifting through garbage to make sure that they're making the most of their AE's time, and then others are focused more on outbound and bringing opportunities to an AE. So yeah, I think I don't know, Bala, if you have any like general trends. I feel like after a certain price point and level of strategic sales, you really need enterprise sellers to be the ones out engaging in the market. And it's probably harder to get SDRs to bird dog a deal for them. And then at the same point, if you're too low, then you're probably leading with more like a product-led growth strategy, where you can route things directly to AEs to close if you need to. And then maybe it's somewhere in the middle where you have this like SDR.
It definitely is. It's sort of, you have to find the right use case for it, I think, in your sales motion or your customer outreach. Now, talking from my days at Salesforce, obviously we had a huge SDR team, and they were really focused on kind of the prospecting aspect of things, right? Which is clearing through the leads, qualifying them, getting them cleaned up with the right set of questions, matching them with the AE, and so you avoid sort of the AEs spending a lot of time doing prospecting work. That was kind of one of the key goals that we tried to make sure that the SDRs were doing that initial qualification and so on. And that works because you have a real wide mix of people. So you certainly weren't doing that with an enterprise IT department, right? You were doing that with more businesses that are able to, more businesses that are like one decision maker kind of ICP. It works quite well where you can call up a single person decision maker and say, okay, here's the value proposition, and they say, oh yeah, I'm interested. Let's go take a look at it. And even in that situation, as you said, they actually send the customer or the prospect over to the website to actually complete the transaction, right? And they didn't actually complete the transaction on the call. And then people started experimenting with the SDR model to say, hey, our enterprise deals are actually taking a really long time to close, right? They take about 9 to 18 months, typically very large companies, and the sales cycles associated with them. So could we deploy the SDRs into the enterprise business to more of, like dial a department, like find a department where you can sell, 5 or 10 licenses into, while the enterprise team is actually working on the more broader deals. And that was done more to kind of smooth out the revenue that you were getting from that whole segment. I think if you talk to different people in the organization, they'll tell you there was sort of varied results with that. Certainly there was success at the beginning, but then it started complicating the relationship with enterprise customers because they were talking to somebody from the organization on a more strategic level, and then you had all these deals that were happening that were more smaller deals, right? So that model has been tried, and what I find is that sometimes you force feed that model into your sales motion, and that doesn't always work. You really have to understand, like, put yourself in the customer's shoe and say, okay, if somebody called me up at 8 o'clock in the morning, which is usually the SDR time right before you start your breakfast, and tell me about this enterprise sale of 100,000 plus deal that I'm going to make, usually doesn't work out, right? Because you want to establish rapport and you want to sort of build trust with the person that you're talking to. All the SDR cares about is just qualifying you and putting you in a meeting with somebody else, right? And that usually doesn't progress very well. So it comes down to that sweet spot and matching the customer's buying experience to what an SDR is able to provide.
Yeah, I really don't like going through that process. I mean, I've been through it a lot. There are a lot of times where I want to buy something.
Yep.
So I'll reach out, I'll fill out something. I'm like, hey, I'm qualified. I want to buy this product.
Yep. And
then I end up connecting with an SDR who can't tell me pricing, can't tell me any of the feature, like the specific questions I have. And then I get booked with an AE in a week or something.
I think one of the things that I've noticed with, especially with SaaS businesses, is that the buying behavior of the customers have changed considerably. And I tell this to our guys all the time, which is, back in the day, the salesperson was the one educating the customer about the product, right? So you'll actually explain to the customer how it works and what all the features are and all of that kind of stuff, right? Now we have a customer who, before they even reach out to you, has done all the research that they need, right? And they're actually educating themselves on alternatives and your product. And the main reason I see customers reaching out is that they have a bunch of anxiety that they want you to address, right, about committing to your product. So in a sense, the salesperson is no longer the educator, is more of the therapist in that conversation, right? Trying to assure the customer that you are indeed making the right choices, and let me address the anxiety that you could not resolve by self-education and all the content that's out there. So that pattern has changed, and the SDR AE pattern is not set up to be the therapist, right? And that's I think where things don't really match up well.
What about CS and account managers, renewals? those things I feel like, you know, that also, and well, really, I mean, going back to Anthony's point with like enterprise and your mid-market and SMB and when it works for SDRs or not, and versus product led, I think it's a very similar type of thought process on the customer success side, where maybe the mid-market, you can have those two roles. Enterprise is interesting because that CS or that customer success person is just so embedded and knows all the people. And then you swoop in with an account manager or renewals person, and they're like, who is this person emailing? You know, the customer's like, who's this person emailing me? You're my person. Like, I don't want to talk to this person. So like, there's all of these levels. And I think actually taking another step beyond this is going back to Bala's point, which is like, what does the customer experience need to be like? And you probably need to think through that part for you to really put together the pieces of the puzzle and how everyone's going to work together to provide the best customer experience for the level that they're at within their company, the level the company is at in your segmentation.
And some of you may have had this experience, but I've worked for two very large companies, and this is a perennial problem where they invent all these roles. And typically what happens is a new customer comes in for a meeting. There's one person from the customer side, and there's 8 people from the company side with roles that are coming in to sort of address this, right? And if you look at it from the company's perspective and the coverage model that they've designed, it makes total sense why there is 8 people in the room. But from a customer standpoint, it's super confusing. Like, why am I talking to 8 people and I don't know what any of them do? And they spent the first half an hour explaining what each of those roles do. And that's not the experience you want to build for your customers, right? So I've seen that happen over, and it's still very much common in sort of very large enterprise software companies. That's a very common practice to see that.
Yeah, I think maybe a good rule of thumb is maybe you should have as many roles as would match the other side of the call or less. If you find yourself bringing 8-to-1 ratios, that's probably not a good thing.
Yeah.
Before I did RevOps, I actually did CS, and I had a pretty good sized team. I had, I think, 40 or so CSMs, a little bit of support, implementation, SEs rolled under there for a little bit. So I've experimented with a lot of different models, like have CSMs own the revenue, bring in AEs to do the contract piece, split onboarding implementation into a role versus not. I think, Bala, to your point, the more simple you can make it, the better. The only caveat I would put, and I was actually very against this at the beginning, of bringing in an AE or bringing in an account manager to do the contract. I was like, this is useless. Like, why? We have somebody in, they have a relationship, they're good with the product, they know everybody. The customer doesn't want to talk to anybody else. But I think at a certain level, for our like strategic enterprise segment, you really do need a team approach to manage an account like that. And when you're hiring CSMs, normally the personality and the profile is to help customers get the most value out of the solution possible, and really be more on the customer side than maybe the company side. So they're usually advocating for the customer to get features built, to escalate any support or engineering requests for that particular customer, and making sure that they're taken care of. And sometimes you can compromise that relationship by having them also manage the contract. And you may not have the right person with the right skills to manage that complex of a contract. I think like mid-market and below, bringing in a commercial layer is probably a waste. But when you get to a certain size, I think you actually need it, because you're usually dealing with really senior people too. So you want somebody pretty senior on your end to work together with them.
Well, what's interesting is, shoot, what was my point with that? That's it. So as you get into the larger companies, you get more established procurement too. And procurement doesn't exist until, like, you don't know about procurement until it's time for the renewal, and then they swoop in and there's like a whole process around that, and having somebody manage that process outside of just the CSM and working with procurement is ideal. And they're also, procurement's not in all the meetings that the CSM is in throughout the year. So it's not like, here, welcome AEAM to all of our powwows. Everyone meet the AEAM. And there's like kind of that weird, who's this person swooping in and trying to sell us more stuff type of vibe. So anyway, that's that.
Yeah. And you get to play a little like good cop, bad cop. The CSM can, hey, this is my person who does the dirty work. I'm here. I'm your friend. I'm here to help you get the most out of our solution.
Yep, that's right. What key performance indicators, KPIs for short, should we prioritize to measure the effectiveness of the coverage model?
Quota attainment, I think, is number one. I don't know, Bala, if you have a different opinion, but are your reps able to get productive based on all the other assumptions that you've made? If they're hitting their quotas or getting close, then I would say it's probably doing pretty well.
Yeah, I think the key angle I tend to look at is ROI, right? And overall, it's an investment that the business is making into those resources, right? And so keeping an ROI lens on that is also, I think, an important aspect. Attainment certainly plays a role in getting to that ROI, but for me, just to make the business case on why you should invest in certain resources or certain type of resources, I think some measure, some KPI that describes the ROI is always very helpful to do that.
And then everything else that we've also already talked about as it relates to productivity. So if you want to measure, and Anthony, you were kind of talking a little bit about like sales cycle length, deal size, things like that. Like, how long does it take you to get to being productive? You're going to want to measure that so that you can put that into your model. And if you're starting to think about like, well, what if we, are able to shorten that cycle length down? How does that actually affect the coverage model? So, maybe not directly related to the effectiveness of the model, but still, I think something important that you're going to track towards the overall, like, is this working or is it not working?
Yeah, and I'll give an example of where you may be hitting your company goals, but your coverage model might be off. I see this quite often. If you have a handful of sellers really bringing in everything, and then you have a ton of sellers maybe they're hitting like 50% of their quota. But if you average everything out, hey, we're hitting our company goal, we're hitting our region's goals, but you're spending a lot of money to do that. That might be one where you need to look at attainment by rep to see if the coverage is working. And also, because that's everything. Did we segment right? Are we producing pipeline in all the areas that we need pipeline? Because if you could do more sales with less sellers, that's always better. If you can get more efficient, do that. The hypothesis is if you add more, you can support them with pipeline, and you built a territory that makes sense for them. But if you're starting to see a trend where you really don't think it's person-based or performance-based, it's really due to a planning issue, then that'll probably be the first canary in the coal mine to tell you that you need to make some changes.
I have a random question that's kind of related to this whole topic. And it's mostly about just like dealing with the change management of like, as we kind of change a coverage model or introduce a new coverage model or add capacity, and you think about like growing this, like how do you, and maybe have you had any experience with the change in like dealing with change management in the organization of like, hey, there's this new role, or we're adding headcount or not, or whatever that might be, and just like talk a little bit about that experience and any kind of pointers for change management?
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. I was alluding to one where we brought in like AEs or account managers to own the commercial piece, and all the CSMs were mad about it. Those are my customers. I think the best things you can do high level is, explain the why really well, explain the importance of everybody else's role and how you want them to be more focused, and this is good for them. Lots of communication, lots of documentation. If you have an enablement team, really lean on them during this time. And then make sure everything's really clear, because you may think it's a simple thing, like, oh, we're just bringing someone to own the contract, but there's probably 50 tasks with your customers that you need to really create a line in the sand of roles and responsibilities and who does what. And a really good rules of engagement document would be helpful too.
How about just blame the CEO?
Always blame the
they said
CEO.
so.
Stupid decisions.
No, I was gonna say there's a
Don't forget the change management on the customer side, right? I mean, this is a very common complaint we get, which is I get a new person emailing me every time there's a renewal from a customer standpoint, right? And a new person comes in and say, hey, I'm handling your renewal this time, and I've never spoken to you before. I don't know anything about your business, but I'm here to close the deal, right? And that, even for us, where we're spending upwards of 50K plus, I have that experience with SaaS companies, and that's it's unfortunate.
Yeah, people value their relationship on the other side and how to do things. So as smooth as you can make that process, the better.
The other thing I was going to say is that I had a real smart person tell me one point in time back in the day when I was getting started in this business. And they said 2 carrots, 1 stick, which is just essentially 2 benefits. And if it's kind of a negative thing, because you're like pulling some of the responsibility from them, right? Like in your case, Anthony, when you're talking about adding an additional role and they're like, those are my customers, I don't want that taken about. There's like kind of this negative sentiment around that. So supplying the 2 benefits for every 1 bad thing that potentially is happening is really important to just help with that organizational change. And I'll say that is just Bala's advice that I picked up a long time ago. So thank you, Bala. I don't know if it actually has worked or not, but
it does. I mean, you got to sell it that way.
Yeah. Anything else? I think we're just about out of time. No more questions, which means I'm just going to wrap. And I just figured I would ask the group if there was anything else they'd like to add. Any silver bullets? Or we said it all?
No, I think we covered a lot. I think I'll just reiterate what I keep saying, which is, as you're putting this together, don't forget the customer, their experience. It matters a lot in terms of how successful your coverage model is. So I think that's the North Star always for me.
And
Great.
the one thing I just want to reiterate is be ready to plan regularly and frequently, and make sure you're set up to measure all of the assumptions you have in your plan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anthony. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And Anthony, we'll see you at the next webinar.
That's right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.